Hello, I'm Michael Brendan Dougherty, a national correspondent at the American Conservative, and I'm here with Zach. Zach, introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Zack Beauchamp. I'm a reporter blogger at Think Progress, and we today are going to be talking about what's on everyone's tongues right now, which is the Todd Akin case. Case is one way of putting it, but it was the Republican Senate candidate, Missouri, and current U.S. representative, made some very, I think, repellent comments about rape. He specifically speculated as to whether there was and wasn't quote-unquote legitimate rape, and claimed that the body had ways of shutting that down, that is to say preventing pregnancy in cases of quote-unquote legitimate rape. And the fallout from these comments has resulted in massive pressure from his own party to drop out. But just a few hours ago on the Mike Huckabee show, he said he wasn't going to, and now we are at an impasse because he has until, well, we'll know if he changes his mind by the time this goes up, but at the time that we're speaking, he has until 6 p.m. Eastern time to withdraw. So, Mike, what do you haven't spoken much about this. What are your views about the whole thing and the way that it's evolved and what Akin said?
All right. So I'm going to put my contrarianism away for just a quick second and say that what is obvious, and just clarify for the commenters and do the most straightforward. What Akin said was exactly as you described it: repellent, ignorant, offensive, mind-blowing in all of those ways, and he should drop out of the race just on that. Beyond that, it was also impolitic, noxious, and I think will cost Republicans that Senate seat if they don't replace him in the next couple of hours. So that's my initial reaction to it. There are lots of side issues to get into, I think, about this, but that's my initial reaction. Is just with everyone else is that this guy should go out. I think it may be difficult to convince him to step out, because when you go out on a blunder like this, you tend not to get invited back to anything. So it's not like the GOP can come to him and say, well, we're going to take away all of the super PAC money and commercial budgets and then offer him something enticing on the other side. They're not going to offer him anything. So politically, I think it's just going to be very difficult to convince him to step out. So that'll be a problem. And I think this could end up hurting Romney and Ryan a little bit. I think we saw earlier in the year when the debates were still going on in the GOP primary that when male Republican politicians are in the position of mansplaining things, it hurts them. The media, rightly pillories them, and I think people respond. And I don't think the media will let it go, and maybe they shouldn't. So that's sort of my assessment initially. What do you think?
Yeah.
Do you have anything to?
Yeah, I'll go in reverse order. First on the shouldn't comment. Yeah, they really shouldn't. And the reason they shouldn't is because the notion that the world can be, or they can be divided into legitimate and illegitimate rapes, or even that it's worth subdividing that category altogether. I'll quote the president here because I think he was right. Rape is rape. And the idea that someone who thinks that it's more complicated than that should hold a position of power. And as Akin recently, with Paul Ryan, co-sponsored a bill in the House that would redefine what rape meant for the purposes of federal funding of abortion in the case of rape. And so the idea that someone who thinks that there are legitimate and illegitimate, less bad or not less bad, or however he meant to parse it, and he's parsed it in a multiplicity of different ways since the comments. The idea that someone like that should be making federal policy on the meaning of rape is beyond me. It's and as long as he stays in the race, I think that he should be responsible.
Right. I mean, you do acknowledge that the law does make distinctions between, you could have consensual sex that is legally statutory rape. And I think that's the distinction he might have been groping towards, but I don't think I can get into his mind exactly.
Yeah, the first time he claimed that what he was trying to draw was a distinction which was in the bill that he and Ryan sponsored, which is called the bizarre phrase forcible rape.
Right.
It's also not clear what that means, again, though there is an FBI page that talks about it. Or at least what Akin meant by that. And the other phrasing that he's later used is he was trying to clarify that, and this was just today, a few hours ago, and it's not helping him. He tried to clarify that Seam was just trying to say that sometimes women might be lying about when they're raping, when they've been raped.
Right.
And that if that's what he meant, wow.
Right. Well, because it's usually, what we accept from the studies is that the opposite is the case. Is that lots of rape goes unreported. Women don't tell authorities when they've been raped. It could be very much the opposite. What Akin expressed there is gross. There are a couple things. I'm trying to think of how to put this in a broader context, sort of like explain how he came to say this, because there have been a lot of little articles put out, that have done Google searches and then found articles on, pro-life activist websites that make similar claims to what Akin made. Now, as someone who is anti-abortion, I've never run into this claim before, ever, right? I've just never run into it. So if it's common, it's not common where I've read or heard. But I think the reason this pseudo, science mythology or whatever exists is the moral dilemma posed by the pro-life case that all abortion should be illegal, even in the case of rape or incest. And it seems like this is an attempt to minimize the seriousness of, that intellectual problem for pro-lifers. That, there's not, this is not a widespread problem where many pregnancies are due to rape. So I would guess that's the motive for telling this lie. Have you seen anything else, or think that there is any other explanation?
Yeah, there's some, but I think that's the meat of it. Is that in certain areas or spheres of the pro-life community, obviously not the ones that you are familiar with, this view appears to exist. I'll add that I've seen an implication from a reverend, a guy named D. James Kennedy, that Akin has cited previously as an intellectual influence. That one of Kennedy's sermons suggests that occasionally women are complicit in, I believe that was his phrasing, in their rape, again, whatever that means. And so it's possible that that's one potential source. We obviously can't tell where Akin's specific view came from on these questions. There's been a number of histories written now on the emergence of the myth that rape can't produce pregnancy. And you're right. I think that the reason that it survives is that there's a certain alternative media ecosystem, very alternative media, obviously, in which that claim isn't challenged, but it's disseminated frequently, the idea that rape can't produce pregnancy. And again, you're right. The motivation is to create a situation in which one of the hardest cases, both politically and morally, I think, though, the moral question is sort of interesting, something I'd like to ask you about.
Yeah. about that.
Yeah, let's just go straight into that. Do you think it's consistent with your views as a member of the pro-life community and someone who has very strong anti-abortion views that to say that an exception can be made for rape and incest?
All right, so we'll do the clarification. People can refer to our last dialogue when I said that I don't believe in rights, including the right to life, but I am anti-abortion. My view, yes, is that abortion is always wrong. In the sense of if you choose to abort a child, it's wrong. Now, this is complicated in my view. I actually have a more complex task than most pro-lifers in trying to explain this, because my case against abortion is built on the responsibilities of parents to the child that they conceived. In the case of rape, the criminal rapist is obviously an unfit parent and should not be involved in a child's life or in the mother's life. And secondly, the mother did not make some kind of conscious act to engage in, a sexual act that could result in a child being born. And so then what would be the basis for her duties to this child? That's an impossibly hard case for my view. My view, which I think is still intuitive, is that this unborn child has some moral worth that precludes the possibility of ending its life deliberately. This view is parodied, or not parodied, but is condemned as punishing a woman with a baby, punishing her a second time with her rape. I recognize that. That this is a reason why rape is so horrible,
But wait, I don't really understand. If your argument is that duties are created by a conscious act of the parent, why is this?
Oh, I don't think it's always conscious, right? Because in the sense of, I believe people who have sex without intending to have a child, but whose contraceptive method fails, etc., I believe they should take responsibility for their act and for the child that they've conceived, even if they didn't intend to conceive it. So I don't place that. But in that case, though, so in a case where you have a responsible couple, a pair of lovers that conceives a child, they know that the sexual act can result in children. They know that contraception, or they should know that contraception can fail, etc. So they do have this conscious, they don't intend to have a child, but they make a conscious decision to perform an act that can result in children.
Well, right, but the point is, at the stage when they're considering getting an abortion, by definition, it's not a full child yet. It's not something that exists outside of the womb independently. I mean, obviously, not by definition in the moral sense, because the moral sense is what we're debating. But I mean, it's not, a fetus is not the same thing as a child that's been born, or a younger stage child or an adult. They're very different creatures with very different cognitive capacities, very different levels of sentience. They're very different in almost every meaningful sense. So when you're saying there's a conscious risk of creating a child, I suppose that's true, but only if you cut out the intervening 9 months in which there's a pregnancy. Right? There's a conscious risk.
Yeah, but logically you're cutting out the very constituent, like DNA. It's not like in 9 months the unborn child could become a tree or could become a desk chair. Like the child upon conception has a unique DNA that is shared, that is built out of the shared DNA of its mother and its father, biologically. It is a new creature. You can say it doesn't have the moral status of a person, but it doesn't share 100% of even the DNA of its mother. It also shares the DNA of its father. In my own reading of the laws of nature, this is a kind of perfect expression biologically of the responsibilities of parents to that child.
But
the child's very genetic code testifies to that. So an unborn child is different than a child, is different than a 95-year-old man with terminal cancer. My view is that at minimum, our minimum obligation here is to not end the life of this child. That if that child receives normal nutrition, care, prenatal care, it will be a human being.
But your argument,
even in your view,
your argument hinges on the assumption that the definition of what makes something "quote unquote" human, I think the term "person" is better, because that's the term that has more broader applicability and doesn't build in certain assumptions, but is just simply DNA. But I don't see what's significant about that for the purposes of defining a creature that has moral status. Because if that's true, there are plenty of other things that have human DNA. Right? It's not just DNA itself. It can't be. That doesn't make any sense. There has to be something else, given that the variety of different things that contain human DNA. I mean, literally, scientists have inserted human DNA, full codes of human DNA, into various different non-human animals. It was the act of inserting that DNA something that turned it into a human for the purposes of your definition? I guess my
no, but what's in those tubes does not, under normal circumstances, become a child.
But why do normal circumstances?
Like my snot when I blow my nose contains DNA from a human being in it, and we all recognize that it's like, just because you think of it one way or another doesn't change its moral status from human to non-human. But in this one case of pregnancy, we say that merely the mental concept we apply to this bit of human DNA changes its moral status from an unborn child for which we have grave responsibilities, awesome responsibilities, that, someone carrying the same thing in their uterus, if they think of it one way, well, then it's a beautiful thing that they're preparing a room for it, that they're buying a crib, that they're planning on a name, on its education. But if you just flip your mind around, it is a parasite, something with no moral status beyond that, a parasite to be removed. I just don't buy it. I don't buy it. Well, it's so unintuitive to me. I actually do feel like I'm living in a different moral universe.
Well,
perhaps I am.
I think you're running together a few things. You posited it almost as a binary, as if something must have no moral status or else have full human moral status. And
all right. What would you say? What would you say if I took? I mean, let's talk about something very real then. What would you say if I put a kitten in a blender? Like if I use sharp blades to end its life?
Yeah, I mean,
like
I don't know if you know my position on this, but I think that we should almost never kill animals. I think that it's usually unjustifiable, except in cases where we have good cause to. And I know where this
you don't want the animal.
What? No, I don't.
Right?
I don't think that particularly matters. I think
like you don't want to take
responsibility.
Like you don't want to take responsibility for the animal.
No, I think you also should not kill the animal. I think that animals, by virtue of various different capacities, the ability to feel pain, a degree of sentience. There was, for example, just a conference. I think it was a mixed group of philosophers and neuroscientists who have determined that animals, according to the best science that we have today, fit all the definitions for consciousness that we give most non-human animals, if not all of them. Fit all the definitions for consciousness that we use for humans today. And while they have a sort of lesser capacity and intellectual, less cognitive capacity, one would say, and certainly less sophisticated reasoning powers, they're still beings that are capable of appreciating their own life, developing goals, etc. Right? And I think all of those things are hugely morally significant. And given that we don't need but fetuses don't have that. Fetuses are at the very beginning.
But the sciences that suggest that that in the womb, unborn children can be affected by the kind of music, that their whole moral psychology can be affected by the music they hear, the type of voice their parents use around them as the child gestates. None of this has any, you don't find any of this significant. And you don't even find it comparable to your feeling about, say, a kitten.
No, I think the issue.
I find that interesting.
I think the issue gets much more complicated as the fetus, ages, and that I think that it's clear, as it is in U.S. law, that late stage abortion is much more morally problematic than early stage abortion. I think that's a much harder case, and I think
morally problematic. It's just an interesting phrase. It is an interesting.
It's a way of saying that the issue isn't as simple as and is extremely complicated and difficult and not hard to resolve immediately in terms of whether or not the fetus qualifies as a human life for the purposes of laws than it is at very early stages. I think the case that an early stage fetus is deserving of the moral respect of a person is totally incoherent unless we also want to literally ban the killing of every sort of animal that exists. Right? It's an entirely inconsistent position.
I don't think so. In the sense of what you are saying is true, that if you ban the killing of a unborn child, and I'm going to insist on using that terminology, if you ban the killing of an unborn child, then you have to ban all murder of animals. Should we then take on the responsibility of banning all murder among animals? That keep your cat away from the mouse in your house?
No, that's sort of a fallacy, because animals, first of all, don't have moral capacities. You can't really judge animals because of the cognitive differences between human and animals. You can't judge animal actions as being right or wrong in the same way that you judge human actions. Not to mention that futzing with the ecosystem has potentially devastating consequences in a lot of circumstances. So it's probably not a good idea to try to extend the reign of human law to the literal jungle. I think that's a red herring. I think that we would have an obligation to minimize animal suffering. I think we do have that. That we're not even coming close. In fact, we're actively participating in the killing of enormous quantities of animals for no good reason, pretty much. But that's
I want to come back to that a little after we get a little bit deeper into this.
Yeah, sure.
But how? I just find it interesting. All of these other creatures that you want to protect, none of them are going to very shortly evolve into helpless babies. We are talking about a period of 9 months of gestation in humans. And you think that a matter of a few weeks changes the object of our law from something that you can legitimately extract in a very violent way to something that absolutely is inviolate. You wouldn't want to put a newborn into a garbage disposal, right? But that newborn was recently, extremely recently, an unborn child. Was a zygote. I don't know. It's not intuitive to me to think that way at all. To think that just my planning, or a mother's planning or unplanning, changes the moral status entirely from that of a child to be welcomed and protected and provided for to the equivalent of a parasite. Well, there's no other object on the planet we think of in that way. There's no other creature we think of in that way. That's why we have actually taboos against, say, blending your kitten, because we've taken kittens, we've domesticated them, and we cherish them. So that's why we have this extremely strong taboo and laws against animal torture, I think. But we don't think that way about other creatures. But to take this thinking to humans is just...
Well, first of all, we don't treat eggs like chicken, do we? Even though an egg would turn into a chicken. right? Eventually, if you just let the egg go before processing it. A chicken egg is something that we think of as being morally different from a chicken. You can't torture an egg.
Right, although some people do argue that vegans do make that exact argument, right? That you wouldn't do this to a human. You wouldn't steal their unborn children and devour them, and therefore it's impermissible to eat a chicken egg.
Yeah, I don't think
that it's, and not only that, but that it's gross.
I don't think that's a particularly compelling argument. I think there are strong justifications for veganism, but not that one. I think the point of the relevant comparison is that your argument was we don't treat any other creature on the planet like that, but we do treat the offspring and the developing, I mean, not yet offspring, the animal fetuses, in the same way that we treat human fetuses. We develop lines that we use to determine what does and doesn't qualify into the sphere of moral consideration. We don't treat everything that's physically alive. We don't treat trees, for example, as things that deserve moral status. That's because we need to apply certain lines, and I think the line that you're trying to draw, which is just that there's something unique about the potential to become human, literally biologically human, is arbitrary. There's nothing. What's morally significant about potential as opposed to what's actually there in the creature itself?
It's not only that. It's not only potential. I mean, it is happening. I mean, the process is happening. You're not talking about like something that all you have to do in a pregnancy. Like it's not like it's not like an unfertilized egg where we're talking about an unfertilized egg that has potential to become a human being if it's fertilized. The unborn child is becoming a newborn, is becoming a chemist or a doctor or a cancer patient someday. Like, it's not potentially, there's no potential. It is in the process. It's like, if I'm driving a car and I have not put my foot on the brake, I could put my foot on the brake. Once I'm doing it, I'm in the process of stopping.
No, of course, potential is the right word, because, I mean, you don't think a miscarriage is murder, right? A miscarriage is a horrible accident.
Right.
And so that could happen in any given pregnancy. So the point is,
right. I'm not saying that can't happen. I could get
potential.
I could get shot in the head.
Yeah, potential is the right way of describing what's taking place here, because the fetus has not yet grown, even though if it would, and there's no guarantee that it will necessarily be unmolested. There's no natural process.
No guarantee.
Yeah, there's no natural. It's not just poof, here comes the fetus, straight line. There's all sorts of intervening things that the woman, and by the way, we really, and I want to bring the conversation to this in a moment, but like just talking about abortion in terms of the fetus leaves out all of the issues about the person in which it is inside, namely the woman who has to bear the fetus for 9 months, and the role that abortion bans have played historically in cementing a particular vision of what the role of women is in society. I think that's inseparable from the issue, because it's a counterbalancing rights consideration, even if I grant you arguments about the fetus. But that the person needs to act in such a way that required for this thing to turn into a living human being that we then grant the same set of human rights that we give to all other humans. Right? It's not just that it evolves, it's that there's a conscious pattern of action by the woman who is bearing the fetus to turn it into a person. Right? She has control.
But a newborn, all right, so let's move it forward.
Yeah.
A newborn has the potential to become an educated, contributing member of society. But the parents have to do all of these things: educate, feed, and nourish. And we have all these laws compelling them to do this, telling them what to do with their labor and their bodies, what to do as parents. It's the same exact thing. The child is not going to become a doctor on its own without any help from anyone, whether the parents or society. I mean, all these arguments of dependence can be attributed anywhere. Then at this point, everything becomes process or potentiality. Oh, so where's your distinction? When does a human being, when does the clump of human DNA become something that deserves the normal respect we grant to human beings that we are welcoming into the world?
Yeah.
When should that respect be given as a matter of taboo, law, etc.?
Here's what
right?
I think. I think
if it's not given,
I think ultimately it's an
right.
extremely hard, bright line to draw. A hard and fast line as to when, in the same way that we don't ever know, I mean, we use convention to determine when a person is an adult, right? 18 is just a line that we've drawn in the sand that says after this, a person has certain rights and the parents no longer have certain obligation towards them, legally speaking, and everything gets separated and so on. And that's a matter of convention. And I think that in terms of how the laws should treat the difference between a fetus and a newborn, I think that the birth is the most coherent, arbitrary line, because ultimately we are going to have to draw some kind of arbitrary line at this point, because it's very hard to tell the exact moment at which something deserves moral status. It's a spectrum. And like I said, I think that abortion becomes an increasingly difficult moral decision as the pregnancy goes on because of the capacities developed by the fetus. That being said, I think that the reason that birth makes sense as a line is because it's one that's easily comprehensible. Society, everyone can tell the difference between these two things. And it doesn't involve curtailing the rights of a woman on the basis of a speculative moral theory.
All right, well, in extreme cases, actually, our society does have difficulty telling the difference. That's why we've had controversies about Born Alive Infants Acts and things like that, where a botched abortion leads to an early birth. And these are extremely rare cases, I grant you.
Yeah.
But that has become contested in law. And I contest your characterization of my moral view. So you say, okay, arbitrarily we'll put it at birth because people can understand it. I will say that I think my bright lines actually make sense. That unborn children become a moral concern even before they are conceived, in the sense of normal adults should be careful about choosing their sexual partners precisely because they could become parents together by being sexual partners. So already my view of the world says that, we take actions in view of our responsibilities toward the future or toward the consequences. Further, the bright line comes when a new human is formed genetically. Actually, it's actually wonderful that science has dispelled the kind of medieval Thomas Aquinas style idea that actually you're bringing into this, which is that the unborn child has this evolving moral status. Aquinas viewed it as like
hardly medieval. It's based on some very, very modern moral theories about what gives a creature moral status. And I say creature deliberately because, as I've been stressing,
your theory, you admit, is totally arbitrary.
No, it's not. The theory. No. Hold on. You're mixing up two things. The theory isn't what's arbitrary. What's arbitrary is essentially the legal line of birth that we draw for a variety of different reasons, but it's necessary to draw in this case. I think your moral theory is arbitrary, which is much more problematic than an arbitrary legal standard, because moral theories are what inform and what really we need to bring into coherence, whereas legal theories can, for reasons of practicality, endorse arbitrary bright lines, i.e., an adult turning into an adult at age 18. Moral theories are supposed to give us a coherent picture of our normative obligation towards the world. Right? And so to say that somehow inserting human DNA, again, I'm not convinced by your answer about chimeras, about creatures that have human DNA.
It's not inserting human DNA, it's insemination of an egg.
That
is what we recognize scientifically and morally for centuries as the beginning of this process of creating a human being.
So that's just an appeal. That's an appeal to tradition. That we've recognized this as the beginning of "quote unquote" human being.
It's very convenient for my view that biology happens to reflect this so well. Whereas my problem with your theory,
I don't understand why biology is morally significant in this case. Sure, it can turn into a human, but why is that relevant? It's the why question that I'm not hearing an answer from in this case.
I think biology is. What do you mean? Why does it matter?
Why does that matter morally? Why does it matter?
It does all the time. I mean, we look at say the parents of children. Like when there is a deadbeat dad and there's a question about his paternity, we look to the genes to determine it definitively. We take this into account all the time, that your genetic relationship implies and imposes these obligations. I mean, this is
that's a separate moral issue. That's a question of how you deal or distribute legal and social responsibility for rearing a child once it's been born. And that's one that,
Right.
again, as part of... a social convention, one can imagine a society like an Israeli kibbutz, say, in which childbearing obligations are shared, in which case biological parenthood doesn't matter very much. What you're appealing to is a social convention, and the reason that we have the legal codes that we do are because of particular social conventions about who should be in charge of taking care of children, because we've chosen to divide society up that way. And that's understandable.
And you are assuming that it's understandable. It actually is quite sensible when you look at biologically how children actually come into the world. That two people make a conscious act, they have sex leads to reproduction leads to this dependent being that has to be nurtured either by the people that conceived it or the rest of society. Now, my problem with your moral view, if you say that parentage doesn't matter until birth, is you create this moral insane asylum of pregnancy where merely the feelings of the adult actors about their responsibilities determine what their responsibilities are.
No, you're mischaracterizing me again. I've said repeatedly that as the fetus develops, it becomes more and more important to take into account the interests of a creature that may actually develop interests. But a fetus, when it's first inseminated, with very little beginning, the zygote version, it doesn't have interests. It doesn't have capacities. It doesn't feel anything about the world. It doesn't have anything that we would associate with moral status in the world. Not anything that we use to distinguish. I mean, it has the living capacities of a tree at the very, very beginning. It's sort of beyond me that by mere virtue of the creature's biological heritage, that distinguishes it from everything else on Earth, which we wouldn't treat, which has a similar amount of capacities, a similar comprehension of the world, a similar capability to feel pain, that all of these lines that we use to determine acts that are wrong, i.e. you shouldn't torture things, you shouldn't limit their freedom, right? These are concepts that only make sense because of the capacities that beings have. So
I totally reject that philosophy, like in its entirety. Like the way you just summed up why we're responsible for things is, I mean, we're coming to the nub of it, right? Where we're coming to the source of our disagreement. I don't believe what you just said. I don't think, as I said, I don't think what you're saying makes sense of the world, actually. I mean, for me, it is intuitive. Parentage is intuitive. Parentage begins... I mean, in most cases, we even recognize just morally that it even begins before conception, in the sense of, like, people think about, how do I plan for my child to enter the world into good circumstances? How do I begin thinking of that? How do I choose the right mate to have children with? Now, those are things that are normal for people that are in courtship or that are engaged to be married or, about to be lovers. The sexual act, we call it sexual reproduction because it reproduces a human being. Parentage begins then. Your responsibilities when you're pregnant are just very normal ones. To feed and to nourish, to care, to not do such strenuous work that you jeopardize the child's life. I mean, and then as the child grows, it becomes to educate, to shelter, etc. Sometimes we have society come in and help. As a child becomes a full adult, it's to share your wisdom. That's my moral view of the world. I don't have these qualifications that, like, if it doesn't have the capacity for pain temporarily as an unborn child, my obligations disappear. Because we'll only get those capacities later. Because if it was capacity to speak or to express or to talk, then when a child goes into a coma suddenly, do your moral obligations to the child cease if your 10-year-old child goes into a coma? Of course not, because they're going to wake up from the coma. The same thing with pregnancy. The baby is coming. Like, the way to stop the baby from coming is an abortion, is to deliberately end its life by a conscious act. I mean, it's not like
I don't think
it's not.
it has a life in any meaningful sense to begin with at that stage in life, right? At that stage in the biological development process, right? It just seems to me that you're describing a series of facts about the world that if a woman doesn't do anything, I mean, if she takes a very series of specific steps, then the child will result as a consequence of that, and ascribing moral responsibility or significance to the fact that if she makes a series of deliberate choices to nurture a fetus, that it will turn into a child, and all of a sudden that magically means the fetus develops the same moral status as a person, whereas an animal, which is way more developed in a variety of different senses, doesn't have the same degrees of moral protections. I mean, we can still kill them for food, whereas you would never countenance killing a fetus for food. I don't see why that's not just simply describing the world and then saying because it is this way, therefore several moral conclusions follow.
Okay, well, I think describing the world as it is and then trying to figure out what's moral because of it.
Well,
that's how I approach
this. This is an is-ought question, right?
Than
just because things are a certain way doesn't mean they ought to be that certain way. Or more to the point, there's no direct relation between the is and the ought in this particular case, right? There's no moral significance.
Oh, I think there.
What is it?
I think there is.
But what is it? You haven't been able to clarify the direct line between these things, other than intuition, in the moral thought that you've been describing. What is the bright line that connects the fact that a mother has to make a series of deliberate choices to bring a child into the world, or to create a child out of the fetus, rather? The fact that is the
wait. You're acting as if like the choice to have. So you're acting like with a pregnant woman, the choice to have an abortion or the choice to continue the pregnancy until childbirth, like that. That they're equivalent, like exactly equivalent, right?
Well, they're choices that a woman could make. She could choose to drink a ton of alcohol or any other form of, or she could choose to go jet skiing. I mean, women make choices about these things, about their lives, and the fetus...
And we're talking about what they ought to make. My position is very simple.
No.
Is that parents have obligations to their children at different times in their lives, including before they're born, before they're conceived, when they're conceived, after conception, during pregnancy.
No, wait a second. Your argument
as toddlers.
Your argument as to how the moral relationship between fetus and parents get established is because there's a certain natural process by which when a child is brought into the world, it's because
of sexual activity. Yes.
No, but the only reason the child comes into the world after sexual activity is because the mother decides that she wants to bring it into the world, right?
Okay, so wait.
My point is that because it requires active choice by the mother to bring a child into the world, therefore there's no natural bright line between conception and birth. There's no reason or logical, consistent pathway between those two things. Everything is dependent on choices made by the mother. Right. So then I don't understand your sort of naturalistic argument that you're making, because it seems to assume that there's a normal set of choices when there's not a normal set of choices. There's simply two sets of choices.
I am literally having extreme difficulty understanding that because a woman could choose to abort a child, that's necessarily equivalent. It's like saying, I'm standing next to Walt. I could choose to let him live. Or I could choose something else. They're equal choices.
No, it's because your argument, as far as you described the abstract moral argument, depended on there being a normal, natural process. And that the child is owed...
there is.
And which is why...
Children are the result of sexual activity that people choose to engage in.
No, a child doesn't... Again, we're getting back to the issue that we started this conversation with. A child isn't a direct result of sexual activity. There's a thing that might one day become a child, but by no stretch of the imagination is it something that comes outside.
That is the lie. We might have to end this. The child, it's like... Could a woman, by a pure act of will, stop her pregnancy without, say, chemicals or surgical tools? Could she just, by an act of will, by choosing, stop it?
Why? I don't understand why that matters. The question is her.
Wait, because you're asking why is there natural? What is the natural?
Well,
thing?
no. My point is
what is the natural? How is that established?
My point is what is the moral significance of something other than it being something that happens biologically? There's no natural process in any given case. That is, we're not talking abstractly about the mystery of birth. We're talking about a specific woman who has a specific fetus developing inside of her, right? And in that particular case, there's no natural process by which it develops. That's why this matters. Because your argument is dependent...
What do you mean there's no natural process? Are you saying that... I literally can't remember.
Okay, sorry. There's no necessary way that her pregnancy has to end. Everything...
Gosh, it's amazing that the human race survived this long without any way to naturally reproduce. I think you're missing my meaning of natural. I mean no meaning of natural... no significance of natural in the sense that like one that will take place without active choice of a person. That is, there's always at every step intervening choice made by an individual person, that is the woman who's carrying the child, and that her choices determine whether or not that carrying the fetus is the word that I think is more accurate, and that her choices in those actions are the ones that determine the outcome of the pregnancy, not just the pure biological process. There's also a key element of choice by the woman. So to describe it abstractly is simply something that evolves, some natural, like rain. It's not like rain. There's an element of human choice in the development of a fetus into a child. And I mean, in some ways, though, you have to admit that there's not, in the sense of like, if a woman, simply wills that the child not develop in the womb, that doesn't actually stop it. And
no, but I don't see what's more significant about the fact that it's not an act of sheer will, but rather an act of a chemical or a surgical procedure. Like the fact
you don't.
No. What is morally significant about the fact that a person could? Why would it be different if, in your mind?
I mean, if we're trying to establish these things in nature, I do think it's significant.
No, I just don't. I don't think the term nature is even applicable to something that's determined and shaped so heavily by human choice. And the fact that abortion was possible even in the Roman Empire suggests that they had to outlaw it because interestingly, because they wanted to preserve the status of men in the society.
Right.
That the fact that abortion has been possible for an extended period of time shows that pregnancy and the development of a fetus into a person depends on a heavy degree of active choice by a mother. And so to say that her element of choice or will or volition in the matter is morally insignificant, and that you can describe a quote-unquote natural pathway that would just take place in a vacuum, I think is to elide the importance of the woman's will in understanding.
I know. I think women are. I'm not doing that at all. I'm just not. I think you're substituting illusions in the sense of will. Like, honestly, I do recognize that women and men choose to couple up and copulate. Like, that is their choice. Pregnancy is the result of that choice. And we're trying to figure out when do parents or society become, when do we obligate them to do good things for the child as opposed to ending their life?
Sorry, I thought you were making a naturalistic argument that because there was a particular course of development that happens...
Oh, I know. I think what I'm trying to do is establish that my view has a kind of intuitive basis in nature.
I guess my point is that appeals to nature make no sense in a world where human volition, first of all, because the fact that nature is nature doesn't mean nature ought to be treated as nature, as you've acknowledged. And second, there's such a heavy element of human choice in this that it doesn't make very much sense to describe it as a purely natural process in the first place.
I mean, morally, to me, it sounds like you're making the case that, you're divorcing.
I'm making the case that we should use moral markers that aren't nature. That is to say that just because something is natural in one very specific sense of the term doesn't mean it's right.
Okay, so the right thing to do is, and you think Well, what is the right thing to do during a pregnancy?
I think that depends on the specific circumstances and the woman in question.
Okay.
I think that
when does it stop? When does motherhood and fatherhood stop depending on the circumstances, and you say you've got to take care of this child? Because we do recognize the state imposes obligations about educating, feeding, cleanliness, right, etc. Unless you're against those, are you for the? Why not the exposure of infants?
Am I against the nuclear family? No.
Why not the exposure of infants? Like, wouldn't that be easier?
What do you mean the exposure of What do you mean the exposure of infants?
Like in the Roman Empire, why not get to know the child first before you decide whether to dispense with it or not? I mean, the child is still dependent on you as a child, as a toddler. Toddler's going to die if it's just out on its own. So
yeah, I think that at that point you should not be going around killing children for the same reason you shouldn't go around killing any other person, or for that matter animals.
You're just letting it die.
I think that killing and letting, again, as we talked about in our last dialogue, I think killing and letting die are the same thing. I think there's no difference between those two things. And
that's interesting.
Letting die is an active choice. And like I said, my general view has always been that there's an element that the fact of choice exists in all of these cases.
Letting live is an act of choice, in the womb or out of it, I suppose. But I don't understand why. Like I said, I just don't find it intuitive.
I just don't think intuition is the guideline that we should be using here. We should develop something that isn't just that. But briefly, I wanted to segue into, now that we've gone over this topic pretty extensively.
Sure.
To the other issue that I raised, which is the issue of abortion and women's status in society. And I think that's really strongly raised by this Akin thing, because it really seemed like there's a deep element of mistrust and misunderstanding and even misogyny underpinning Akin's quote about quote-unquote legitimate rape. And I think that the fact that's connected to an absolutist position on abortion in some cases isn't coincidental, not in all cases. Because I think that controlling a woman's means of reproduction by the state, like again, the Roman example is a good one that I like going back to, is a way of controlling the status of women in society. Do you think that's problematic, that women who often, because of an one could say institutional sexism or a history of that in human society, that women end up becoming unable or unequally responsible for the care of children that they might not have wanted to raise in a world where abortion is criminalized, and then as a consequence can't pursue their own goals, choices, etc., with respect to careers, with respect to perhaps other family choices, just generally individual self-determination. Do you think that's a problematic element of an abortion criminalization?
It's problematic. Yeah. I mean, on the most basic level, I mean, we're dealing with the human condition, which is always a problem.
But shouldn't that have some weight in this argument, like a significant amount of weight?
Well, listen,
it's not just.
I think there are. I mean, I am the first one, and very recently have made the case that fathers are not compelled to do enough for their children by the state, and more specifically by society. I mean, I think, I think when the history books are written of our era, it will be a shocking revelation that fatherhood could be reduced to Wednesday night and every other weekend and a check. That literally fatherhood was so legally truncated. And I do think that there are resources in our past we can turn to. I mean, if you look at the laws about, if you want to talk about the status of men and women in regards to child rearing, adultery, rape, I mean, you can see even in the history of this continent where adultery and fornication by men were punished more heavily in the Massachusetts colonies, and then in Virginia women were punished way more harshly for those crimes, even capital punishment for cuckolding and things like that. I absolutely think that there is an inequality, but I think that the direction I think of it in is different than yours. I mean, I think of this inequality as we inadequately compel men to take on responsibilities towards forming families, whereas I think you want to increase the availability of choice about our obligations to each other and what they mean.
Well, about the ability to choose what kind of family you want to raise and when you want to raise it. I mean,
right.
I don't think the state can solve institutionalized in a lot of ways, and this is an interesting thing given that I'm the liberal and you're the conservative in this conversation for me to say, but I don't think that the state itself, by compelling men, or in certain cases to do more with respect to parenting, can solve institutionalized sexism and gender role issues, which cause an unequal distribution of goods inside the family. For example, men get paid significantly more for doing the same job than women, which means it's in some ways for an individual family more rational if they absolutely need one parent to stay home to make to have the woman stay home. But the consequence of that is that women are systematically disempowered. And the reason for that isn't because the family is making an irrational choice. It's because that individual family is being controlled and shaped by the institutional sexism that pervades society. Right, so I just don't know how much your proposed solution can do to fix this inequality.
Oh, I don't think I'm not interested necessarily in, I mean, this is where we're coming to an extreme gulf of worldviews.
Yeah.
So I'm not interested at all. This is going to be like one of those quotes that they put on the bottom, and then all the commenters reduce my worldview to who pays me or what a medieval monster I am. But I'm not interested in the type of egalitarianism you're aiming for.
You're not interested in giving men and women equal access to different parts of society, that is political life, business life, entertainment life, social life, any of that?
Not in the way you're pointing. I mean, I am for, it'll be so easy to caricature mine as sort of like a male chauvinism or something like that. But how do I put this? I think it's going to be very difficult, right? So I'll start with some of the practical stuff first. I think it is very difficult to eliminate the pay gap for several reasons. Some of them are sexism. Some things that I think you would call sexism, I don't know if I accept they're based in some kind of animus towards women, either explicit.
Well, sexism
implicit.
isn't just about animus. It's
no. I know, but
yeah.
I don't accept because I don't accept egalitarianism as the state we should be in, where everyone has sort of equal access to everything. There are lots of things that are not going to come up on my radar as morally problematic, or that are solvable, right? So, like, one thing that you would say would be sexist, right? People don't typically do this anymore, and if they do, they don't call it this. But, it used to be some employers paid men differently based on their marital status for the same work, right? The idea that there were family wages that were different from the wages that you would give to a single person. Now, if you take egalitarianism as your baseline, that is an extremely sexist way of forming a world. I don't find it to be that. But I guess it's because I view that most people, their vocation in life is family life, and so I want society to build and treasure that more than, say, access to political or economic life.
I mean, I think what matters is in any given case, and the strength of a family ties principally, I think, matter to the family that's involved. That is to say, the state's business is to ensure that every citizen, right, and I'm probably just restating an egalitarian credo that you're going to immediately disagree with, but the state's responsibility to its citizens is to ensure that everyone, every individual person or family, if they choose to become a family, is to leave their lives as much as possible to their discretion, to allow them to develop their lives and their family's life in the way that they choose and the way that they find most valuable and most fulfilling. And I think that's sort of the bedrock assumption
but the thing is,
liberal democracy.
But the thing is, one decision can change all the others, right? So you lift the taboo on if you take steps to, say, encourage. I mean, if labor markets are markets, the amount of women who enter the labor force or who exit it for whatever reason changed the price of labor. There's a reason. I mean, we are a richer society than they were 100 years ago, obviously. But the kind of social policies and the kind of cultural taboos that we've developed over the past century, I think you would admit they shape people towards, a lot of people towards two-income homes, towards, having to hire people to take care of their children rather than having one parent stay home or another.
I think that happens.
And I wouldn't say that this is totally something of the late 20th century till now either. I mean, I'm also talking about, I could implicate the Industrial Revolution in a lot of this as well. But I suppose, in my worldview, I wish to, in general, if I'm thinking of the story, I want to exalt the status of mothers and fathers at the expense of bankers and stock jobbers and firemen. I think we have to, have an economic life where we interact with each other as a single peg. As, I'm a specialist, I write these things, you do electrician work. But I don't see the highest good as trying to maximize people's choice in that arena or in the political arena.
Well, why is it the state's responsibility to make the decision for individual men and women, especially given a long history of discrimination against women, using similar justifications to the argument that you've made? It's not like our conversation's taking place in a vacuum. Concerns about families have been used by policymakers essentially, fundamentally, to disadvantage women for quite some time.
Right. Well, what we're arguing about, though, is what is advantageous for either individuals or for society. And there are competing interests, right? So if you if you shape an economic sphere that encourages the maximization of choice or in the economic life, you actually might constrain choices in family life. That's why people struggle. Should my wife continue to work or should she stay home? Well, the kind of choices, the kind of cultural and legal choices we make about how to structure that can make that more or less difficult.
Well, sure, but shouldn't the point of the state to balance that as much as possible? That is, to give each individual person the choice to optimize, right? To develop a family life or a professional life, and balance them in the way that they see fit. I don't know what sort of institutional arrangements best fit that balance, but I do know that the current balance that we have and the current way that laws are worded in the context of the society we live in is one that does not give women the access to the same sphere of choices in either the family or the professional realms as it does to men.
All right. Well, and you take that. What's interesting too is you take the evidence, right? So the pay gap, which is evident. I mean, as evidence of institutional sexism, whether overt, covert, explicit, or implicit, built in.
I mean, we can go through the list, the panoply of evidence on this point.
Oh yeah, we can, but in spheres where that flips, like in college admissions, where women are doing better than men, or in degree completion, do you take that as evidence of implicit or explicit, matriarchy? Or do you think that that's...
No, and I think that that's not particularly... It's not a particularly interesting question, because we live in a world where institutionalized sexism has been a fact. Where that just... To borrow a common feminist slogan, the patriarchy is real, right? And it has been for quite some time. So to be invisible to the built-in advantages that men have, and that we, just by virtue of our biological makeup, when we enter into life, right, is to not factor that into your analysis of any given case.
Okay, well, if the
is to be blind to something that's true.
If the patriarchy is real and it pervades, as you say it does, why is the patriarchy failing at colleges, in college admissions and degree?
It's not like it's complicated. It's not like an organized conspiracy,
right?
In the sense that there are like little meetings where men go and sit. Otherwise, I think you and I would both be invited. Where men go and sit and get to plan how we're going to keep women down this week. Rather, it's that there's a variety of different social forces. Some of them are beliefs. Some of them are institutional arrangements.
Right. We agree with that.
Yeah.
We agree with that. But, but then also, we're talking about how we might reshape our beliefs or our institutions. So It's interesting to me when a feminist makes the case that the very fact that women make choices in their lives where they choose either not to ask for a raise, or they choose to stay home and take care of children instead of choosing advancing their career, is itself evidence of patriarchal sexism.
And a lot of that is because of the way that women describe those choices, the actual lived experiences of women when you ask them about why did I make this choice, or why wasn't I given an option, and the answer oftentimes is that there are social arrangements that prevented me from being able to make the choice that I wanted to, and I'm doing what I can in a world that doesn't give me the same options as men. And I think that's why a lot of the time it's taken as evidence. It's not just the sheer fact of discrepancies. It's also the observations of countless women who have had to make these choices, and who aren't just, who feel like they could have lived otherwise had it not been for being treated differently than their male compatriots in different circumstances.
And I grant that is the case, and is unfairly so in many instances. But there are, like I said, balancing these, as you admit, it is so complicated to balance these, right? So, and in fact, that's what I was talking about when I said that we don't shape the choices that men make enough in some cases. I would like some men to have society or the state, in some cases, demand that they take on more responsibility for their family life, even when they don't want to, even when they want to, want a divorce, want to start over, want to move away and start a new career. I don't necessarily privilege their individual choice. And so I wouldn't necessarily if I wouldn't do it for men, I wouldn't do it for women either. And that's the thing. I grant that, the kind of... It's interesting, too, because this plays out so differently. I think a lot of people would want to indict my religious views from my social views in this case. But I would strongly want to disassociate myself with the kind of the view of women that started to prevail in the English-speaking world in the past few centuries, where women were infantilized into children.
I would hope so.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that is like a biblical view of women or a Christian view of women. But I don't. I guess one of my problems with the entire modern world is the privilege we give economic and political life over family life. Not that one could live without the. I don't think one can live without the other. I suppose I'm kind of trailing off here.
It's okay. We're actually probably out of time.
Yeah.
So I have many things to say about that, but we'll have to leave it for another day. As again, we're out of time. So I guess thanks to everybody for talking to us. Mike, anything else you want to add?
Okay, I just want to add one thing. This is funny. To everyone who's been listening to this, hating my views and disagreeing with me, I want to assure you, you're winning. And you won't have to worry about hearing my views for very long. They will be stigmatized to the point where I won't be allowed to say them or invited to say them in public. So, go you. That's about it.
Well, on that dour note,
I mean,
we'll have to leave it.
You can still read about them in books and stuff and laugh, but like, I just want to assure everyone that you're winning, that there's not some great reactionary force that could instantialize my views on anything.
Well, I see conservatives' pessimism is alive and well.
Excellent.
It turns out.
Yes,
So,
it's invigorating too.
All right. Take care.
All right, take care, Zach. Bye.